Roselle Klein-Sharzock is Professor Emerita of Education, who has had a 45-year career as an educator on all levels. She's currently a collage artist and writer, and she's written or edited 6 books on such topics as education, history, including Jewish history, and teaching about the Holocaust. She's very excited tonight to talk to you about her most recent book, The Jewish World of Elvis Presley. And here is Roselle.
Thank you, Justin. A pleasure to be here, and I am very happy to have the opportunity to talk about a book which I enjoyed researching, and maybe I enjoyed the research more than the writing, but I also felt wonderful about what I discovered about a man who I had some, limited thoughts about. I mean, I grew up at the time that he was just beginning to make it. I'm going to be 77, so I was there for the 50s and the 60s. And Elvis, and I also was very sad to see what happened in the 70s, later 70s. But I wasn't a big fan of Elvis's, and I think I bought one record of his, Heartbreak Hotel. Some of you may remember Heartbreak Hotel. That was where he sounded a little sexy, like he was very appealing. And I remember buying the 45 RPM or something like that, whatever they called them, and that was the only record I bought. And so what made me interested in him is, you might be saying, like, okay, if you're not a fan, why did you bother doing this research and writing a book? Well, I'll tell you how it came to happen, and it's kind of an odd way of getting into this whole subject of the Jewish world of Elvis Presley. The way it happened was that, and this is exactly how it happened. I was in bed one night, and I'm just not falling asleep right away, and my mind is wandering around. You all know what that's like. And I also have to mention to you that one of my passions is vintage clothing. So, and I wear some of it, and I enjoy collecting dresses from the 1940s. So anyway, I was thinking about vintage clothing and who wore vintage clothing. Were there any famous people who wore it? And for some reason, what came into my mind was Elvis Presley wearing some of those plaid jackets. Maybe I have a picture here that you can see. I don't know if that's showing up, but that was sort of the picture I had in my mind. He wore these cool clothes, and they were very 50s. And so I lay there and I say, I liked some of Elvis's clothes. They were really cool. And I wonder who his tailor was. So I took my iPhone from the side of the bed, and I Googled Elvis Presley, his tailors. I don't know what made me do it, but I did it. And what came up was the Lansky Brothers. So by the way, no relation to Meyer Lansky. So the Lansky Brothers name came up, Bernard and his brother, and they were his tailors, and they dressed him from the time, even before he became famous to the day he died. And so I thought, it's not unusual to have a Jewish tailor. There's a lot of Jewish tailors. But then, I don't know, I got kind of interested. I said, well, I'm going to look up the Lanskys and see who these guys are. Well, it turned out that not only were they his tailors, but Bernard became a very close friend of Elvis's. He had a relationship with him. They talked all the time. And it was a beautiful thing from what I read online. I just said, this is amazing. Elvis Presley having a close Jewish friend, it never didn't make sense. But I thought, that's amazing. So I woke up the next morning and I said, I wonder if he has any other Jewish friends. This is kind of interesting. And that was the beginning. I started peeling the onion. I found out that half of the people that belonged to his inner circle, they were called the Memphis Mafia. Half of them were Jewish. I couldn't believe it. I found out that he lived below in a duplex, a house. He lived below a rabbi, and that he and the rabbi and the rabbi's wife and Gladys, Elvis's mother, that they became close friends, intimate friends. I found out that he learned about the Jewish religion from one of the members of his inner circle. Just one thing after another kept coming up, and that his own heritage was Jewish. It was amazing. And I said, this is a story that has to be told. I don't think people know about this. And you might ask, well, where did I find these bits of information about all of his connections? And I just read and read and read everything I could get my hands on, anything that had anything to do with Elvis Presley. And little pieces here and there. There was nobody who had ever written about the Jewish world of Elvis Presley, but there were little pieces everywhere, and I pulled them together. And I interviewed a lot of people who were his friends, as well as Bernard had died already, but Hal Lansky, Bernard's son, took over the business. I became friends with Hal. The point is, that's how it started. It started with vintage clothing. And I know it seems kind of strange, but that's how I came to this subject. And I think another interesting, before I get into some of the stories of those relationships that Elvis had with Jews, that I might mention his connection to a very recent phenomena in this country. As you all know, we're just coming out of a pandemic, and there's still debates about the vaccinations. Of course, I'm fully vaccinated. It was no debate for me. I was going to get out there as fast as I could, but not everybody has been doing that. So there's a little bit of a controversy over vaccinations. So what does that have to do with Elvis? The amazing thing is that Elvis Presley, and let me just show you this picture, and then I'll tell you the story. What you see here is Elvis Presley getting inoculated with the polio vaccine. And the doctor who gave him the shot was Dr. Harold First, a Jewish doctor, and Leona Baumgartner, who was a health official in New York City. She was holding Elvis's arm. So what's the story there? What happened was that when the vaccinations for the polio disease started being given, the aim was children and teenagers. And so there was not a problem with children because their parents were in charge of them, but the teenagers resisted getting the polio vaccination. So the authorities were trying to figure out, how do we get the kids, these teenagers, these kids who, we all know what teenagers are like. We were once teenagers ourselves. How do we get them to get the shot? So one of them had the idea, one of these officials got the idea of seeing if Elvis would be willing to get the polio shot on television, or at least that it would be viewed in the news, and that might inspire young people, because like 2% of the teenagers had gotten the polio vaccine at that point. So at the point when, I'll give you the exact date, October 28th, 1956, Elvis is about to go on to the Ed Sullivan Show, which really shot him into stardom. And he was backstage, and the press showed up for the big occasion. The occasion being, he's going to get a polio shot, and that photograph is going to go all over the country. And there he was. This photograph hit all the newspapers in the country, and before too long, almost 98% of the teenagers had gotten their vaccinations. And when the officials tried to figure out, is it just because of Elvis that they decided they were going to do it? Well, they say that that was the main reason. There might have been other reasons, of course, but the fact that Elvis Presley got a public polio shot really made a big difference in the health of this country. So I think that to me, it's a very symbolic event because it shows you who this person was. What I try to show in the book is that he was one of the most generous, giving, caring humanitarians that ever lived among stars. He truly wanted to make this a better world. It may have been a result of a lot of factors, and I'll talk about some of those now. So let's start out with the topic in my first chapter, which I read over the chapter and I still can't believe what I'm reading because it's just so amazing. The first chapter is called Jewish Roots, Jewish Symbols. And I'll start with the fact that Elvis's mother, Gladys, sat him down. And by the way, this was told to me by two of Elvis's best friends. They said Elvis told them this story. That Gladys sat Elvis down when he was very young, and he said, Elvis, we have Jewish blood, but don't tell anybody because people don't like Jews. Now, one of those people who didn't like Jews was his father, Vernon. And there's a lot of evidence of his anti-Semitism, which I write about in the book. But for now, let's just say this is something that they didn't talk about with Vernon. So Elvis found that interesting and he kept it in his mind. And she explained to him that, I don't know what her words were, but the fact is that if you are descended from an uninterrupted line of Jewish women, of women who go back to a Jewish matriarch, then you are considered a Jew. And the story is that this author named Elaine Dundee wrote a book called Gladys and Elvis. And she's the first person who wrote about the idea that Elvis had Jewish roots. She said he was a real mix of a lot of things, Scottish and English and Native American and all kinds of heritages, including his Jewish heritage. How did she come up with this information that he had Jewish blood? This Elaine Dundee, who was a sort of retired journalist and actress. Well, she had gone down, in order to write her book, she went down to Memphis and tried to interview as many people who knew Elvis. And she came across a man named Oscar Tackett. And Oscar Tackett was a descendant of Abner Tackett. Abner Tackett was married to a Lithuanian Jewish woman named Nancy Burdine. We don't know if that's her exact name, but Nancy Burdine in the 1850s came to the South from Lithuania. She married Abner Tackett. Fast forward, Abner Tackett's descendant, Oscar, tells Elaine Dundee that this story, that my ancestor, Oscar, married a Jewish woman. And so Nancy Burdine was the first of the line of women who then produced Gladys Presley, or Gladys Smith was her name. So Gladys was the fifth. So basically, this woman, Nancy Burdine, was Elvis's great-great-grandmother. And what happened was, and most of you know that according to Jewish law, if there's an uninterrupted line of Jewish women, that makes you a Jew, and therefore Elvis Presley is a Jew. Now, he never practiced Judaism, as we know. He was a First Assembly of God churchgoer. That's where he learned to sing, and he loved gospel, and he loved the music. He was First Assembly of God, fundamentalist Christian. But his mother told him that they had that lineage. And so even though he never practiced Judaism, never identified as a Jew, according to Jewish law, he's a Jew. So that's why she said she wanted to share this with him, that he had Jewish blood. So at that point, we don't see a lot of activity. Although I do have to tell you something that I found out recently. A woman, he was born in Tupelo, by the way, and in Tupelo, I didn't know if there were any Jews there. As far as I knew, he met his first Jews when he moved to Memphis at the age of 13. But I heard from a woman from Florida, I don't know if she'll want me to mention her name, but she, with a very strong Southern accent, she said she was born in Tupelo, and her daddy, their last name was Weiner, and he had a department store, and the Presleys shopped at the Weiner's department store in Tupelo. So I learned something after the book was out already, that he had met Jews, and he would go in there and he would make sure that his daddy, he'd say, did my daddy pay all the bills? I mean, Elvis was so concerned about doing the right thing all of his life, believe it or not. He may have had quirks, but he was really a straight and narrow guy in terms of ethics. So at this point, as an historian, I looked for evidence, and I wasn't convinced that this was true, that he was, just because Elaine Dundee says that she talked to this Tackett guy and he told her this, you know what historians need. They need paper. They need to see documentation. They need to see evidence. So when I wrote that first chapter back in something like 2016, I was really skeptical. So I never emphatically said he was, Jewish according to Jewish law, because I wasn't ready to do that. I said, it is said by Elaine Dundee, and it is thought that he had Jewish blood. But let's go to 2018. I hadn't finished the book yet, thank God. In 2018, I come across an article in the Memphis newspaper. It says that Gladys Presley's gravestone has been restored. I said, oh my goodness. So now I'm going to tell you the story of how Elvis in 1964 had a Jewish star placed on his mother's gravestone. How did that happen? Well, she died in 1958. 1964, he's already pretty famous, as you know, or may not know, but he was pretty famous by 1964. And he went to visit his mother's grave frequently. And two of his Jewish friends came with him one time. Marty Lacker and Larry Geller accompanied him to the grave. And he said, he looked at his two Jewish friends and he said, you know, I think I want a Star of David put on my mother's stone. Immediately, Marty Lacker took care of it. And before too long, there was a Star of David on the stone. And that's the way it looked more or less before, not early on, but later. I'll tell you in a minute what I mean. So you can see the Jewish star, you can see the cross across from one another. And that's because Elvis wanted it placed there. And that was done. Then, that's 1964. Then in 1977, Elvis dies. His grave is next to his mother. Vernon says, I'm concerned about grave robbing. People are coming and trying to take things from Elvis's grave, you know, his mausoleum. So he said, I want both graves, my wife's and my son's grave, moved to Graceland. So the one with the Jewish star, that's Gladys's, and Elvis's gravestone, all of it's taken to Graceland. And nobody knows what happened to the one with the, you know, to Gladys's gravestone. We don't know. And the thought was maybe, you know, maybe Vernon had it destroyed or had it stored away, and that was the end of it. So as of 1977, nobody ever saw that gravestone again. And when I visited Graceland, I saw, you know, the plaques that were now considered the gravestones. There were these bronze plaques for each of the members of the family, including Gladys and Elvis. So in 2018, what happened was that Angie Marchese, who is the archivist at Graceland, she was exploring the millions of objects in the warehouse. Oh my God, there's thousands upon thousands of objects related to, you know, Elvis and his history. And she comes across the gravestone and she sees the Jewish star on it. It might be all cracked and stuff, but there it is. In 2018, Angie Marchese has the gravestone, Gladys's gravestone, restored and placed in the meditation garden at Graceland. Do you understand the significance of that? That is a statement by the Elvis authorities, EPE, Elvis Presley Enterprises. That is a statement that they have confirmed Elvis's Jewish roots. So if you go to Graceland now, you will see that he, you know, this confirmation that Elvis's mother had Jewish roots there, and he was descended from a line of Jewish women, that he was, in terms of his heritage, partly Jewish. And when I read that article, I said, well, I don't need documentation. I have the Elvis Presley Enterprise Authority saying he was Jewish. And that was quite a discovery. So at this point, Elvis, so let's go back to his friend Larry Geller. Larry Geller was, unlike a lot of Elvis's other friends, Larry was his hairdresser initially. And the first time Larry met Elvis, it was as his hair, he went, this was out in Hollywood, and Elvis was making a film, and his hairdresser went on to something else, and they needed a hairdresser. So they called Larry Geller, who had a good reputation. He came over, and he and Elvis started to talk to one another. And he was about to start working with Elvis's hair, but they got caught up in a discussion. And what the discussion was Larry, that Elvis looked at Larry and he said, you know, what are you all about? Like, who are you? And, you know, Larry said he wasn't sure he should admit that he was like a vegetarian, and he was into, you know, yoga, and he was into all of these esoteric philosophies, Eastern philosophies, Western philosophies. But he said, okay, I'm going to be honest with Elvis. I'm going to tell him this is who I am, you know. And so he started talking about the books that he reads and so on. And Elvis said to Larry, I need to know about these ideas. I need to hear them. I've had some trouble figuring things out. And what was he trying to figure out? He was at a point in his life, and this is like, you know, the early 60s. He was at a point in his life where he was asking the following questions. Why am I Elvis? Why have I become the most famous? You know, why am I being praised and adored and clothes ripped off my back? Why has this happened to me? And his second question was, why did I survive when my twin brother died at birth? That haunted him all his life. His brother, Jesse, died, and, you know, survivor's guilt, whatever it is, why me? Why did I survive? He wanted answers to these questions. So he started reading the books that Larry gave him. And one of the books that Larry sat down with him and discussed with him was the Kabbalah. Now, when I found that out, I thought, no way, Elvis Presley and Kabbalah. But so it was. And not only that, but he loved the Kabbalah. He loved every word of it. He wanted to understand everything in it. He learned about chai, what chai means, among other things. And as soon as he understood what the meaning was, life, long life, he wore a chai. There are photographs in the book of Elvis wearing a chai at his biggest concerts. He also wore a Star of David along with the cross. So he found out, and he particularly loved the gematria, the analysis of symbols and the words and numbers and how they all fit together and they can help you understand character and life. And so they started analyzing his name. And Larry said, let's look at your name, Elvis. What does it mean? El, God. This, power, the power of God. And Elvis was just amazed at the meaning of his name and how he had a middle name of Aaron, and he started to change the spelling of the middle name. It was spelled Aron, and he wanted to be the biblical form. After he became familiar with the Jewish teachings, he changed it to a double A at the beginning. He was fascinated by all of these readings, by Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy. He would carry around one particular book. It had to do with a philosophy of what is God, and the author of this book had said, God is in all of us. We all carry God within us, and we have that responsibility of doing good. And Elvis loved that message, the idea that there was God within all of us. So he carried that book around with him. Larry has the books that Elvis wrote in. He wrote in the margins things that meant something to him from the Kabbalah and from other books that he was reading, because he was a thinker. He was a searcher. He wanted to understand life. And no one was more surprised than I when I found this out. Now, the sad thing and by the way, I got to know Larry Geller very well, and I have to say, he's still alive, living in Sedona. I say that he's still alive because during the time I've written this book, 3 of Elvis's best friends died. George Klein, one of his Jewish friends, died not long ago. Marty Lacker, who I was in touch with via email, and he was the one who testified to Vernon's anti-Semitism, because he was the target of that anti-Semitism. He's also died. There are a couple of others who have died, and Patty Perry. Probably a lot of you don't realize, and I didn't know this before I started doing the research, that there was a Jewish female member of his inner circle. She was, her name was Patty Perry, and she was not romantically involved with him at all. She became his little sister. I don't know if you remember that Elvis had a song called Little Sister, and he considered her his little sister, and she would call herself his Jewish mama, even though they were more or less the same age. And she devoted her entire life to him. And I write about her, and I think it's one of the parts of the book that practically nobody, even his closest fans, know about this Jewish woman who became his little sister. It's a sad story too, because, well, Patty Perry, you know, she She got married quite late. She didn't have children because she was so devoted to Elvis. And she said to her husband, you know, it sort of got there was a lot of tension because her husband was a little jealous of her relationship with Elvis. And so she had some downtimes because of that relationship and because people would just want to know about her relationship with Elvis. And she said in one of her interviews that she went to a therapist. She was trying to, you know, unload some of this, you know, this baggage of everybody wanting to know what Elvis was really like. And so she sits down with the therapist, and the first question he asks her is, what's Elvis really like? You know, she just didn't have a chance. And I think she had a tough time towards the end. And it's a very sad story, but she devoted her life to him, and very few people know about that. So anyway, Larry Geller became my biggest source of information. We were in touch by phone, we were in touch by email. He is a very giving person. And one of the things he told me, he told me stories about Elvis, the kinds of things he said. Here's an example. They were talking one time, and Larry said, and Elvis said to Larry, I don't understand something, Larry. I go into my church and they talk about all the prophets, Ezekiel, and they talk about Moses and Abraham with praising words. And then I walk out of my church and they say those goddamn Jews. I don't understand that. What kind of hypocrisy is this? This is Elvis Presley talking. You know, this is something, you know, nobody understands that the king of rock and roll was a thinking, caring person and disgusted by any kind of prejudice, including what he saw around him. Another thing he said to Larry was, you know, people should look at the fact that Jesus was a Jew. They ought to look at the great Jews, Freud, and all of the great writers, you know, Einstein, the scientists. You know, he said, if you look back in history, it could be that we're all descended from Jews. He opened that mind of his to the fact that there was a lot of prejudice. And one of the things he did to try to overcome that is that he was incredibly generous. He gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Jewish Community Center in Memphis. And he continued to do that throughout his life, every year. He gave to a lot of other charities too, but he was very attached to the Jewish Community Center in Memphis. Why? Because when he was a very poor kid who had nothing, who was made fun of because of his pimples and his raggedy clothes, and he literally was, you know, from a sharecropping family originally, who was nice to him when he moved to Memphis? The Jewish Community Center. They gave him a free membership and said, come and join. You can be part of us. He learned to play racquetball at that Jewish Community Center. How many of you knew that he was a fabulous racquetball player? And I interviewed a famous, well, he's not famous to many of us, but in the racquetball world, there's a Jewish guy who played on Elvis's racquetball court at Graceland. And Elvis would sit there and watch these professional racquetball players who came to Graceland to play on his racquetball court. And he would learn a lot about the game, and he would play a lot. In fact, he played racquetball the night, the morning of the day he died. He played, because that was the way he got out a lot of his tensions and so on. And I was in touch with this famous racquetball player, and he said he had never met a nicer guy than Elvis Presley. This was a sweet, good man who treated everybody well. He didn't get close to Elvis, but he got to hang out with him, and he said he was a good man. So that's the story of Larry's connection to, there's many more stories. I'll end the story with Larry by telling you that because Elvis was so taken up with the books that Larry was giving him, guess who got upset? Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager. He was disgusted with Larry because what was Larry doing? He was taking Elvis's mind off music. He was taking his mind off of performing. And it made, the Colonel was interested in one thing. You all know what it is. Think about it. Yeah, money. It's all he cared about. So if Elvis is being distracted by reading these esoteric books and these philosophical works, he's not paying attention to the music in the way that the Colonel wanted him to. And who else was jealous of Larry Geller? Were the other members of the Memphis Mafia. They were not intellectuals like Larry. Larry was exceptional. In fact, one author that I read said that Larry Geller was Elvis's purest friend, his true intimate friend, because he confided, Elvis confided in him. So Larry, became sort of the whipping boy of the group. People would call him Lawrence of Arabia, or Larry of Arabia, or what were some of the other names? I mean, just really put down names of Larry. And Larry saw the writing on the wall, and he knew he was going to be fired. One of the things he heard was that the Colonel wanted to burn every one of those books. And so it was getting to a very tense part. So rather than waiting around to be fired, he left. And Larry worked for six years in a bookstore, and he re-met Elvis at a concert, and Elvis said, "Larry, come back to me, come back." So for the last 6 years of Elvis's life, Larry was there for him. And in fact, when Elvis died, Larry was the man who did Elvis's hair, because he was going to be lying in a grave, lying in a coffin that people would be looking at, and he wanted Elvis to look his best. So Larry Geller was quite a source of information, and certainly, and I'd like to tell, there's so many stories, and I wish I could go on forever, and I want you to tell me when I'm at my point where we need to have questions, because I could talk on and on. Let me tell you a little bit about the choices between telling you about the rabbi that Elvis got to know, and or Bernard Lansky. Both of them are great stories, but I don't know if I'll have time to tell both. You'll have to read about it. I think I'll tell you about the rabbi. It's one of the most heartwarming stories, and there's a full chapter devoted to the relationship between Rabbi Alfred Fruchter, his wife Jeanette, Elvis Presley, and Elvis's mom. Elvis's mother, Gladys, became very close to Jeanette, and they would often have coffee together. They lived in, remember, a duplex, and the rabbi lived upstairs and the Presleys lived downstairs. And by the way, the Presleys didn't always get to live in those kinds of circumstances. This was actually a step up from the public housing that they had been in. They were still poor. They were in an area of Memphis called the Pinch. I don't know if any of you know about Memphis, but that was the place where the immigrants and a lot of poor people lived before they went on to better neighborhoods. And so you had a rabbi who was fairly poor. He had come there to be the head of a private Jewish day school, and also to be the rabbi of the Orthodox synagogue. But they didn't have a lot of money at the time. And so the rabbi lived upstairs in this duplex, the Presleys lived downstairs. And as I said, they became friends. And he became their Shabbos goy. Now, I don't use that word anymore. I think we say Shabbos helper, but we all know what that means. Elvis became the Fruchter's Shabbos helper. He would turn the lights on Shabbos. He would help them with anything, any kind of work that they had to do, and they loved him. And they invited him to Sabbath dinners. They invited him to Passover. They invited him to I'm trying to think of the word, when you build a hut. So he was in there, and he celebrated all these holidays. He would sit at their Sabbath table with a yarmulke on. In fact, Jeanette is I read her obituary, and I read an interview that had been done with her, and she said that Elvis carried a yarmulke around in his pocket in case he had to, do something for the rabbi. And then there are other stories that he began to eat his peanut butter and banana sandwiches. You may know that was his favorite food. He began to eat his peanut butter and banana sandwiches on challah, and that became one of his favorite foods. And when he would talk about loving Simmus, Jeanette talked about he loved her Simmus, and he loved listening to the music of the cantors that Alfred Fruchter would play. And a lot of people have said you know, this guy was like, he was 17 years old, 18 years old, and he's listening to this music, and then maybe that influenced some of the music that he sang. We don't know. I mean, I'll tell you what really was the influence is the fact that 8 out of 10 of his very top songwriters were Jews. 8 out of 10 of his very top. And my answer to where did some of the Jewish influence in his music come from, it would be from them, because they all grew up with Jewish music, either in their synagogues or, you know, in their families and so on. But anyway, getting back to Jeanette. Jeanette loved Elvis. She saw him as a son, and they started having children, by the way, while they were living in Memphis. And I just would love, I don't know if I'll find it. Yeah, this picture shows Elvis, and he's got a pipe in his mouth. This shows Elvis with the rabbis, 2 of the rabbi's children. Elvis supposedly, now I'm getting this information from Rabbi Fruchter's daughter, who's in her 60s now, and who I was able to interview, and I was able to read articles or interviews that she had done. And she said that when her mother brought home one of the babies that she had when they were in Memphis, that Elvis ran out of the house and said, "Mrs. Fruchter, can I please have the pleasure of carrying your baby upstairs?" And the story goes that every time he saw her with groceries and she was taking them upstairs, he would run out and take them from her. And what's interesting is they had just this beautiful relationship. And apparently Jeanette would have coffee with Gladys. And according to Jeanette, this is Jeanette talking, Gladys would say to her, "You know, I'm worried about Elvis. You know, I don't know what he's going to become. I don't know what, I just don't know what's going to happen. I'm worried about him." And Jeanette said, "Don't worry. Someday he's going to make you proud." Okay, we know what happened. But that's one of the stories. They talk to each other about their children, about babies, about life. It's a beautiful scene. And so Jeanette, when Elvis graduated from high school, that was the year that they lived together, you know, in the same house. It was the year that he graduated. And that's also the year that his first record came out. But she gave him, for his graduation, onyx, you know, what do you put here in your sleeves, in your shirts? Pin, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, cuffs.
Cufflinks.
Thank you very much. Cufflinks. She gave him onyx cufflinks. And he thanked her and said, "I have never owned anything that costs this much, that is this beautiful." And he hugged her and thanked her profusely and said, you know, he was just so appreciative. And of course, we know that paled next to the diamond rings that he wore later on. But it was that year, the year of living underneath the rabbi, that Elvis Presley came out with the record, "That's All Right, Mama," which went wild. It was the beginning of his stardom. And how did he get to listen to the record that he made? He didn't have a record player. He had to go upstairs and use the rabbi's record player. And when all of the phone calls came in congratulating him on his amazing success with that record, it was the rabbi's telephone that he used. The Presleys did not have enough money for a phonograph or a telephone. And it was this Jewish rabbi and his wife, part of what he considered family, that allowed him to use these resources. And I'll just end that story by saying one other thing. Both of them moved out of that duplex, more or less at the same time. The rabbi got a post out in California. By the way, the rabbi's last post was in Troy, which is not far from where I live. But anyway, after Memphis, he went out to California, near San Francisco. And Elvis moved out because he now had enough money to buy a real house of his own. It wasn't Graceland yet, but it was his own house with a swimming pool and everything. And so when Elvis is on tour, he's out in California. The rabbi decides he's going to surprise Elvis and try to go backstage and see him, because they hadn't seen each other for a while. He goes backstage with a note it says, explains that he'd like to see Elvis. He knew Elvis in Memphis. And he goes backstage, and George Klein, who's one of the Jewish members of the Memphis Mafia, says, "This is my rabbi. This was my rabbi in Memphis. What's he doing here?" So he gives the note to Elvis, and Elvis says, "Yes, let's bring him in. Bring him here." He takes him backstage, and they hug each other. The rabbi and Elvis are happy to see each other. And Elvis says, "I have to go on in a minute, but I have a press conference right now. Why don't you come with me?" So Rabbi Fruchter goes with Elvis to the press conference that's backstage in this auditorium in San Francisco. And Elvis stands up and he says, "I want you all to meet my rabbi." And that was exactly how he considered Rabbi Fruchter his rabbi. And I think that's a beautiful idea that Elvis saw that rabbi in that way. And it was, the rabbi said he said he would never forget it. He was interviewed many times. And by the way, I've gotten to know two or three of the five rabbis' children, and they all have told the stories that their parents shared with them. And now their kids, the Fruchter's grandkids, are sharing stories. And I was fortunate enough to get to know two of those of the rabbi's children who shared a lot of wonderful information. Chaim, Harold, is one of them, and he feels very proud that he was the one who got carried upstairs by Elvis, and he also sings at Jewish occasions and at Jewish weddings and so on. So he feels like a little of Elvis sort of rubbed off on him. So that's the story of the rabbi and who lived upstairs, and it's a beautiful story. I don't know if maybe we want questions yet. It's up to you.
Let's take some questions, and if we have some more time, perhaps you can talk about that second story.
Yes.
Here. So yes. This one comes from Diane. She's asking, why did Elvis become obese, and was it the result of illegal drug use?
Okay. Elvis lived the life that a lot of musicians, and you probably are aware of all of these very famous rock musicians who died of drug overdoses, drug abuse. And it has to do with the lifestyle. The lifestyle is hell. It's murder. You're up when you should be sleeping, and you're sleeping when you should be up. His regular, wake up time was at night. And in the morning, he had to try to sleep. And that was not so easy after a full night of activity. So he was taking uppers to wake up, downers to go to sleep. He had a number of problems, all kinds of issues, glaucoma. I think he had like 3 or 4 various illnesses. So he took these drugs, which we now know, like oxycontin, and we now know that they're addictive, and it's a scandal. But they didn't know that then. He called all of those addictive drugs his medicines. He never called them drugs. They were my medicines. I have a right to take my medicines. And, he was a smart guy. He read medical texts. So he knew the downsides of these, but he still said, I need them and I want them. And nobody could tell him no. There were a lot of people who tried to get him help. He had overdoses. He was in and out of the hospital. He had several overdoses. He kept going back to his medicines. And what was sad is that many of the members of his inner circle also were on these medicines. And what happened was, when his doctor, and he was a Greek-American doctor, Nicopolis, he was a very caring guy, and Elvis loved his doctor, and the doctor loved him. So when Elvis died, and they all sort of, landed on the doctor, like, why did you let him have all these drugs? Why did you feed him these drugs? Why didn't you say no? The doctor said, I didn't give him that many, number one. It's his friends. His friends were all on drugs too. They gave him a lot of those drugs. But the fact is that Nicopolis was found guilty of over-prescribing, and he lost his license. It's another long story, which is in the book. But so Elvis was addicted, as so many. We have we have an epidemic right now with that kind of drug, with those kinds of drugs, addictive drugs. And so Elvis was involved with those drugs, and he said they were his medicines, and he wasn't going to, nobody could tell him not to take them. And it's a very sad story. And so that, of course, and then he let himself get fat because food was a comfort to him. He wasn't exactly a healthy eater. You know, Larry said to me, if I had been able to be there those 6 years that he was not there, he would have been a good eater, because Larry is this very thin guy who knows what good diets are all about and what healthy food is. And he said he would have helped Elvis, but there was no one there like Larry at the time who could help him get straight. And by the time Larry came back into the fold, it was too late. Elvis was on his way to this kind of massive addiction and not being able to get off of it.
So we have two questions about Vernon from Elaine and also Harvey. You know, Vernon was known for his anti-Semitism, and the idea, did he ever come clean or acknowledge it, that it was wrong, or at least tone it down some?
No, he never did. And I think Elvis knew it. I think Elvis knew that his father was anti-Semitic, and it's a miracle. You know, Larry says it's a miracle, and Marty Lacker said it's a miracle that Elvis didn't turn out to be a bigot. He was living with one. It's because, and what I write about in the book is how Elvis rose above. He rose above his environment. He rose above his you know, the religious prejudices of his church. He rose above because he saw it was wrong. And that applies to African Americans. He loved African Americans. There are people who said he was a racist. No, not true. There is an enormous amount of evidence of the number of African Americans who loved him, who he loved, who he went to their churches to listen to their gospel. He loved Black gospel. He only listened to Black radio stations in Memphis as a kid. He loved the music. He followed all of the Black artists who sang gospel and rock and roll and so on. And what's interesting, and I include this in my epilogue, what's interesting is when Fats Domino, how many of you know Fats Domino? Okay. When Fats Domino died, Elvis was interviewed, and Elvis said, "I'm not the king of rock and roll. Fats Domino is the real king of rock and roll." This was an unprejudiced man who grew up with a very prejudiced father who overcame what he heard and saw. And I don't know, I mean, I never found any evidence that they talked about it with each other, but I do not have any evidence that Vernon ever apologized for his prejudices.
So this comes from Betty. She's asking about Al DeVoren, Elvis's road manager in the late 60s and 70s. And just looking for more information on him. And apparently he's the one that made that phrase, "Elvis has left the building."
That's right. Okay. He's in the book. Al Goren is in the book. At the very end of the book, I have an appendix. And there are 10 people who are sort of encapsulated there with photographs and so on. They didn't get a whole chapter like Bernie Lansky or the Rabbi, but they were important to him. So yeah, Al DeVoren was very close with Elvis, but Larry Geller told me that Al DeVoren was the sweetest guy. He wore his Judaism on his sleeve, and he is known for saying Elvis has left the building. But apparently he wasn't the one who coined it. We're not sure who coined it, but he was the one who used it at the end of every concert to get people to leave the building. So when he would say that, that meant you're not going to see an encore, you're not going to see him again, go. He died a tragic death. He was actually on his way back from an Elvis impersonator contest or something with another person who worked for Elvis, and the car crashed, and he died in that car crash. But he according to Larry Geller, Al was very proud of his Judaism, very proud of the role that he played in Elvis's life as his sort of, you know, taking care of business kind of. Oh, and he was also the one who hawked Elvis memorabilia at these concerts. So he would, you know, stand up and ask people to, don't you want, you know, something to take home? So he was a good man from all I could see. And his photograph is in the book with standing next to Elvis.
This comes from Maryland. Did you ever get to speak to Priscilla?
Okay. That's an interesting question, and it's a good question. I wanted to talk to Priscilla. And as I told you, a lot of people who I did get in touch with, I found the contact information online somewhere. Her contact information was nowhere to be found. And Hal Lansky, who I told you is the son who runs Lansky Brothers now, he was a little reluctant to hand over this information. He gave me an enormous amount of information. He talked all about the Memphis Jews and the difference between the German Jews and the Russian Jews, and he belongs to both synagogues because the Orthodox and the Reform, because he wants to be friends with all of his people. So he gave me an enormous amount of information, but he wasn't prepared to give me her information because I think she's very private and doesn't want anybody to give it. So when I sort of hit a blank wall with him, I knew I wasn't going to get any information. He thinks that she will love the book, but I don't know if she's read it. And she also was very aware of Elvis's love of all religions and interest in all religions, particularly the Jewish religion. She was very cognizant of that. And she said she was frustrated with all the books that he was reading, and it took away from attention to her when they were married. And also he loved women. He didn't, I'll let you in on a little sex secret here. He didn't sleep around, but he had a woman every minute of his life. He loved to have a woman in his bed. He loved the cuddling and all of that goes with it, but he was not, interested in a lot of the sex. He just needed a woman all the time around him. And she, and this was even after he was married. So, there were a lot of reasons why she left him.
Doris, do you have a question? Oh, hold on. Doris, you got to unmute there. Hey, Doris.
No, it was just a comment for you and Roselle. That's all. Not for the whole group.
No, I was saying Doris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Doris. Do you want to unmute? Do you know how? Or oops.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
I just wanted to tell everyone to buy this book. It is so interesting. I loved every minute of it. Not only just about him, but about the different Jews and everything. I thought it was just a fascinating book, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Doris. I appreciate that very much. I do. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, and also thank you. Doris goes to my congregation in Houston, and she sent me an email, and I ran with it. And so really, this program wouldn't have happened without Doris over there. So appreciate it, Doris.
Double thank you.
And we have a question.
Has a bit of a Southern accent too.
Here's a question from Ariel. Did Elvis have a relationship with the Jewish or the Italian mob? And if so, what was it?
No, the answer is no. There's a thought that they tried very early on in his career that they tried, but it never happened. He was saved. Maybe I'm not sure why he was saved from that connection, but there's evidence that they did try to get in on the way that they got to Sinatra and all of that. But no, there was no mob connection that I could find anywhere. No.
And this is from Saul. He says, I read that Elvis descended from a Jewish woman whose family immigrated after the Revolutionary War. And is that true or fiction?
Well, it was in the 1850s, and she came here with her family from Lithuania. And that's when she married into a Christian family, and that was the end of her practice. But she gave birth to a woman, and then that woman gave birth to a woman, and so on. And then Gladys was born, and the fifth in the line.
Yeah, that's true. Does anyone want to hear another story? I mean, up to you all. I can. Okay, how about this? I'll make my closing comments now, and then if you want to stick around for another story, Roselle, you'll give us another story?
I'm happy to, okay, yes.
Awesome. So I'll just make some quick comments. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks to Doris, as I said, with the idea. Thanks to Roselle for joining us from Great Barrington. I know when I mentioned the time, she was a little worried, but that was a really good presentation. Also, thank you to what we had 10 partners from 7 states. So again, thanks for joining us on this June 13th. And if you'd like to stick around for another story, you can.
Thank you, Justine.
No problem.
Okay. Shall I start?
Go for it.
Okay. So I want you all to meet Bernard Lansky, because Bernard was a very special guy. Okay. So Bernard, I'm going to show you. This is a photograph of Bernard Lansky fitting Elvis in a nice coat. And Bernard really loved Elvis. And by the way, I'll just show you this picture also. This is a photograph of me and Hal. This is Bernard's son. Hal took over the business, and he now has not one store, but 5 stores. How many of you know the Peabody Hotel in Memphis? Well, 2 of those stores are in the Peabody Hotel. And if you don't know the Peabody Hotel, you have to find out about it, because there's ducks that come into the lobby and into the fountain, etc. I'm not going to take up too much time, but the Peabody Hotel has a Jewish connection. That hotel, which is just an incredible place, was where Elvis went to his prom. He went to the prom in a suit that he rented from the Lansky Brothers, his senior prom. And that hotel was going to be demolished. But a Jewish family came along and said, we can't let that happen. This is an historic hotel. This must be preserved. And they spent millions restoring the Peabody Hotel. I talk about that family in the book because they were so special. There's a chapter in the book, by the way, about Memphis Jews, a brief history. So I go into the whole, when did Jews first start coming to Memphis, and what is the, what's the variety there, and the synagogues that are there, and so on. So there's a lot about Memphis Jews. And so one of the things was about that. And so, Bernard, Hal, I should say, I think I told you earlier, Hal belongs to both synagogues, so that he doesn't alienate anybody. He's a good businessman. But anyway, this Jewish family restored the Peabody Hotel, but that's not relevant necessarily to the story of Bernard and Elvis. What happened was Elvis was this pimply-faced, greasy-haired guy, 17 years old, didn't have very much money, and worked part-time at a local movie theater. And this is when he's in his senior year of high school. And Beale Street was the happening place. Beale Street, for those of you who are not aware, was where the African Americans hung out. That was their area. But all the stores were owned by Jews. And one of those stores was Lansky Brothers. So Elvis, who didn't have very much money, just what he got, and he would take home the paycheck from the movie theater where he was an usher. He would take home the paycheck and give it to his mama. And he was, never looking out for himself. Anyway, to get a feeling of, what's possible, he went around the corner from the movie theater to Lansky Brothers, and he would go every day and he would look in the window of Lansky Brothers' store because he loved those clothes. They were flashy. They were what the black dudes were wearing on Beale Street, and he wanted to wear those clothes, but he couldn't afford it. Every day he'd go, and Bernie would see this guy looking through the window. So one day he said, "Come on in, son, come on in." And by the way, Bernie spoke with a Yiddish accent, and Bernie was an immigrant, and Bernie's favorite saying was "Nachamol." You all know what that means, but if you don't, I'll tell you. What, this too? Like out of frustration, "Nachamol," again. So he would talk a little Yiddish here, and by the way, Elvis picked some of that up too. But anyway, so he saw Elvis, and he felt sorry for the kid. He's looking at the window all the time. Brent invites him in, and Elvis said to him, "Someday when I make a lot of money, sir," and he never called, even though he got close with some of these Jewish merchants and they loved him and he loved them, he never called them by their first name. He said Mr. Lansky all of his life. And Bernard would say, "Call me Bernard." "No, Mr. Lansky, you deserve respect, sir." So anyway, Bernard invites him in. He says, "When I make enough money, I'm going to buy you out, Mr. Lansky." And Mr. Lansky says to Elvis, "Don't buy me out, just buy from me." And that's the way the legend goes. And Elvis started buying a shirt here and a pair of pants there with the meager money he was making. And then this record comes out. And suddenly he's making a little bit of money. So he also rents out the tuxedo I told you from the Lansky Brothers. He got to know Bernard early on. And when it was time, when he became really famous and he's living at Graceland, Bernard sends the truck full of clothing out for Elvis to inspect and decide what does he want to keep. And Hal said to me, I would drive that truck out, Roselle. I would drive that truck and deliver all those clothes to Elvis. And you know what? I never came back with one piece of clothing. He kept it all. So it's a beautiful story. And he would visit all the time. If he needed any kind of clothing, he would go there. And well, you know, I'll just finish by saying that you know, when he died, Bernard took out a full-page tribute to Elvis, his greatest customer. And it was Bernard who dressed Elvis for his coffin in a white suit, white shirt, and a blue necktie. And Bernard would say, you know, I dressed that boy from the time he was a kid to the day he died, and he was a good man. They loved each other. They truly loved each other. And Hal knows that Lansky Brothers is in great shape and always will be, because nobody goes to Graceland without stopping at a Lansky Brothers store. And actually Bernard said something like this in an interview. He said, you know, they come to Graceland and they all come here because it's like saying Kaddish. You have to come to Lansky Brothers if you're an Elvis fan, but it's a good Kaddish. It's a happy Kaddish. And he knew that Elvis brought him these people, so to speak, from the graves. And you know, that forever and ever up to this day, people go to Lansky Brothers because of that relationship. And it was the place that Elvis bought his clothing. So it was a lovely relationship. And he gave the Lanskys all kinds of presents. I mean, the thing about Elvis is, if you said something, by the way, his dentist, Lester Hoffman, was Jewish. And Lester said one time, you know, he was at Graceland and he said to Elvis, you know, I really love that organ, Elvis. It's a beautiful organ. And Elvis said, well, okay, I'm glad you like it. And that night, Elvis had his men pack up the organ, put it in the truck, and bring it to Lester Hoffman's house. And Lester, as a gift to Lester and his wife, because if you said in front of Elvis that you liked something, it would be automatically given to you. That's who he was. He wanted to make people happy, and he gave all kinds of presents to all kinds of people. And there's one interview I read that said, I had to be careful that I didn't say, you know, that I liked something, because Elvis would immediately go out and buy me one of those, whatever I liked. So so the Lansky Brothers, you know, really loved Elvis and know that part of their success is due to him.
Cool.
Any other questions?
We actually do have a couple more in the chat here. Where was that one? Judy's asking about Elvis's, you know, did he have any formal music training?
You know, that's a very good question. His mom bought him his first guitar when he was 13. And he didn't have any real formal training. He just sort of picked away at it and learned how to play the guitar. But you know what? He was born, and we all know this is true, with people who can sit down at a piano, never had a lesson in their lives, and they can play anything. That was Elvis. His real instrument was the piano. He could sit down and play anything, and he did. There's a beautiful story of how, such a long story, I'll try to make it really short. In one of the shows that he did, it was the Comeback Special, it was called. It was a whole different thing where he was going to have an orchestra, and it's the first time that an orchestra was going to be accompanying him. And the musical director was a little timid about, you know, like, I'm going to be sitting down with Elvis, you know, that's not my thing. Like, I'm not into rock and roll, but you know, I'm going to work with him. So this Jewish music director came in to the studio to work with Elvis and to try to plan out the show and everything. And Elvis was playing Moonlight Sonata. And this guy said, he was shocked, like, he's playing a classical music. So Elvis looked up at the guy who came in and he said, do you know this? Do you know this piece? And the director said, yeah, I do. He said, well, what comes after this? And so the music director sat down next to him. He showed him what came next, and the two of them played the Moonlight Sonata together. This is the kind of genius he had. He was a genius. Of that, there's no question. Musically, every songwriter who worked with him said he was a perfectionist when it came to the music. He knew the music backwards and forwards. He would take nothing less than perfection, and he knew what needed to be done in terms of making the sound right. So he didn't have formal training. If you want to hear him sort of plucking out a little tune of Hava Nagila on YouTube, you could try go to YouTube and put Elvis Presley Hava Nagila, and you'll see that he's trying to do he doesn't quite get there, but he tries. That's the only evidence that I knew he knew a little Hebrew, but very little. But yeah.
All right, well, two more questions, then we'll let you go, Roselle. This comes from Marilyn, wanting to know, have you been in touch with Elvis's daughter?
No, but a very tragic thing happened. Lisa Marie had 3 children, I believe. One of them was Benjamin. And Benjamin committed suicide last year at the age of 27. You can imagine what it would be like to be Elvis Presley's grandson. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And that was part of the pressure. Plus, he also got addicted to drugs. And I can tell you that I was thinking of putting him in the book, but I chose not to. But the reason I thought of putting him in the book is because a photograph of Ben was published after he died, and he's wearing a Jewish star. And I have never been able to find out, why Ben was wearing a Star of David. Like, what did he know of the Jewish heritage? I don't know the answer to that. But Lisa Marie is another one who's very, very hard to contact.
And lastly, from Jan, have you recorded your book, like books on tape? Have you recorded your book on tape, your books on tape?
I would love to. And I have to look into that. I'm not sure how that works. And people have said to me that I need to pursue that, but I haven't done it yet. I will do it. And I think there's people out there I know who can help me with that. So it's a good idea.
Well, yeah, and the book can be, Amazon's the only place, is that correct?
Amazon.com, yes.
So Amazon.com, and I know I was Stacy from Columbia, Maryland mentioned that it's available at a library there. So.
Oh yes, some people have. Some libraries may have bought it or been donated. A book may have been donated to them, but the best way to do it is Amazon.com. And
I think on Amazon, someone was just saying that you can also put in a request, I guess, for a Kindle edition as well.
I don't think they have a Kindle edition.
Okay.
I don't be disappointed. So, I'll say up front, there is no Kindle edition.
Okay. Sorry, Linda. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks again, everyone, for coming, and really appreciate your participation, Roselle, everyone.
And I want to thank everybody very, very much. I really love
everyone. They can say goodbye, and I'll try.
Wish I could meet all of you.